On the afternoon of July 3, 1940, the heavy guns of the British Royal Navy roared to life, unleashing a devastating barrage of high explosives. But they were not firing at the Nazis. They were not aiming at the Italian fascists. They were firing at their own brothers in arms. In just under 15 minutes, nearly 1,300 French sailors were blown to pieces, burned alive or drowned, slaughtered by the very British allies they had fought alongside just weeks prior. It remains one of the most shocking and controversial orders in modern military history. Why did Winston Churchill, the great defender of the free world, order the cold-blooded destruction of an Allied fleet? Was it a stroke of ruthless genius that saved Britain, or a paranoid act of betrayal? Welcome, please come in and find a comfortable seat. It is good to see you again. Tonight the fire is warm, but the history we must delve into is chillingly cold. We are looking at Operation Catapult, the tragedy of Mers-el-Kebir. It is a story that still leaves a bitter taste in the mouths of naval historians, a moment when the survival of an empire demanded the sacrifice of its friends. To understand the impossible weight resting on Winston Churchill's shoulders, we must travel back to the darkest days of the summer of 1940. Try to put yourself in that desperate moment. The unimaginable had happened. France, possessing one of the finest armies in the world, had collapsed under the mechanized lightning of the German blitzkrieg in a mere 6 weeks. The British army had narrowly escaped total annihilation on the beaches of Dunkirk, leaving behind their tanks, their artillery, and their hope. Britain now stood entirely alone. Across the narrow English Channel, Hitler's war machine was gathering, preparing for Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of the British Isles. But there was one massive obstacle standing between Adolf Hitler and the conquest of Britain: the Royal Navy. As long as Britain controlled the seas, the German army could not cross the Channel. However, the balance of naval power was precariously fragile, and here is where the great terrifying variable entered the equation: the French Navy, the Marine Nationale. It was the 4th largest and one of the most modern navies on the planet. They boasted magnificent state-of-the-art battleships like the Dunkirk and the Strasbourg, fast, heavily armored, and boasting massive firepower. If the German Kriegsmarine and the Italian Navy managed to seize the French fleet and combine their strength, the Royal Navy would be completely outgunned. The survival of Britain, the survival of the free world, hung by a single thread. The French commander of the Navy, Admiral François Darlan, had given his solemn word of honor to the British that his beloved ships would never, ever fall into German hands. But when the French signed the armistice with Germany on June 22nd, Churchill read the terms with growing horror. Article 8 of the treaty stipulated that all French naval vessels were to be collected in their home ports and disarmed under German or Italian supervision. Hitler promised, of course, that he would not use the French ships for his own war efforts, but as Churchill famously knew, a promise from Adolf Hitler was worth absolutely nothing. Legend has it that Churchill paced the war rooms for nights on end, cigar in hand, agonizing over the decision. Some historians speculate that this was the single most agonizing choice of his entire premiership. He simply could not risk the survival of his nation on the word of a dictator and the wounded pride of a defeated ally. And so, with a heavy heart, the War Cabinet made a brutal, unforgiving decision. The French fleet, currently anchored in the North African port of Mers-el-Kébir in French Algeria, had to be neutralized. It must join the British, sail to a neutral port, or be sent to the bottom of the sea. Churchill dispatched Force H, a powerful British naval squadron based in Gibraltar, commanded by Vice Admiral James Somerville. Somerville was a reluctant executioner. He knew these French officers. He respected them. The thought of turning his 15-inch guns on them was sickening. Yet, orders were orders. On the morning of July 3rd, the British warships arrived off the coast of Algeria, dropping anchor just outside the harbour. The trap was set. The British sent a destroyer, HMS Foxhound, carrying Captain Cedric Holland, a man who spoke fluent French and was a friend to many in the French fleet, to deliver the ultimatum to the French commander, Admiral Mers-el-Kébir. The ultimatum was blunt and left no room for negotiation. Captain Holland handed over the document, which offered the French several choices, each more bitter than the last. First, sail with the British and continue the fight against the Axis powers. Second, sail with reduced crews to a British port, where the ships would be impounded. Third, sail their ships to a distant port in the French West Indies or the United States to be demilitarized. If Gensoul refused, the British demanded he scuttle his own ships within 6 hours. And finally, the terrible conclusion: if none of these offers were accepted, Force H would use whatever force was necessary to destroy them. It was a loaded gun held to the head of a proud naval tradition. Gensoul, deeply insulted, felt he was being treated as a prisoner. As the scorching Algerian sun beat down on the steel decks of the trapped French battleships, the tension in the harbour grew thick enough to cut with a knife. The British sailors manned their battle stations, looking through their rangefinders at the very men they had been toasting in taverns just a month prior. They prayed the French would see reason. But pride, my friends, is a dangerous companion in a time of war. The hours ticked by, agonizingly slow. The oppressive heat of the Algerian sun was matched only by the rising panic within the French fleet. Admiral Mers-el-Kébir was a proud, perhaps overly proud, officer of the Marine Nationale. The British ultimatum, delivered by Captain Holland, felt less like a strategic necessity and more like an unbearable insult. The French had bled alongside the British. They had fought a devastating holding action to allow the evacuation at Dunkirk. To now be treated as a hostile force, to be given an ultimatum with guns trained upon them in their own harbour, was a profound humiliation. Gensoul initially refused to even meet with Captain Holland face to face, sending a subordinate instead. It was a fatal delay in a situation where every minute counted. When they finally did speak, Gensoul assured Holland that the French fleet would sooner scuttle itself than surrender to the Germans or the Italians. He reiterated the solemn promise of Admiral Darlan, but Churchill was not in the business of trusting promises when the survival of his island nation was at stake. Back in London, the War Cabinet watched the clock with mounting dread. Churchill, some say, chain-smoked cigars, his mood darkening with every passing hour. He knew the world was watching. He needed to prove to the United States, and particularly to President Franklin D. Roosevelt, that Britain would never surrender, that they possessed the ruthless determination required to fight on regardless of the cost. The destruction of the French fleet would be a brutal demonstration of British resolve. It was a horrific political calculation, but one Churchill believed was absolutely necessary. As the deadline of 5:30 p.m. approached, the situation in the harbour of Mers-el-Kebir grew increasingly desperate. The French battleships, the pride of their navy, were moored stern first to the mole. It was the absolute worst possible position to receive an attack. Their massive main armaments, designed to engage enemy fleets on the open ocean, were largely pointing inland towards the cliffs, useless against the British squadron waiting outside the harbour entrance. Force H, commanded by the reluctant Vice Admiral James Somerville, was a formidable assembly of naval power. It included the battlecruiser HMS Hood, the battleships Resolution and Valiant, the aircraft carrier Ark Royal, and a screen of cruisers and destroyers. Somerville had signalled London, pleading for more time, hoping against hope that a peaceful resolution could still be reached. He abhorred the orders he had been given. It is said that many British sailors wept openly at their stations, knowing what they were about to be ordered to do. But Churchill was unyielding. The order came back. French ships must comply with our terms, or sink themselves, or be sunk by you before dark. The die was cast. At 5:54 p.m. on that fateful July evening, the terrible silence of the harbour was shattered. The order was given, and the massive 15-inch guns of the British capital ships erupted in a deafening crescendo. The first salvo from HMS Hood, the pride of the Royal Navy, tore through the air. The shells, each weighing nearly a ton, arched over the breakwater and plunged into the tightly packed French anchorage. It was not a battle, it was a massacre. The French ships, trapped at their moorings, were sitting ducks. The old battleship Bretagne was struck almost immediately. A massive explosion ripped through her magazines, and within minutes, she capsized and sank, taking nearly 1,000 of her crew down with her in a fiery inferno. It was a scene of apocalyptic horror. The mighty Dunkirk, the flagship, desperately tried to return fire, her guns thundering in defiance, but she was quickly overwhelmed by the relentless British barrage. She suffered multiple devastating hits and was forced to run aground to avoid sinking. The battleship Provence was also heavily damaged and beached. The harbour of Mers-el-Kebir was transformed into a cauldron of smoke, fire, and twisted steel. The water boiled with explosions, and the screams of dying sailors echoed across the bay. In less than a quarter of an hour, the back of the French fleet had been broken. It was a slaughter that would stain the waters of the Mediterranean for generations. Yet amidst the chaos and the carnage, one French battleship managed a miraculous, desperate escape. The Strasbourg, under the command of Captain Louis Collinet, slipped her moorings as the first British shells fell. In a brilliant display of seamanship and sheer audacity, Collinet navigated his massive ship through the burning wreckage of his comrades, dodged the minefields, and made a break for the open sea. Accompanied by 5 destroyers, the Strasbourg outran the pursuing British forces and managed to reach the safety of Toulon, heavily damaged but still afloat. The escape of the Strasbourg was a bitter pill for the British to swallow, a reminder that even in their darkest hour, the French Navy remained a formidable adversary. But the strategic objective of Operation Catapult had been achieved. The threat of the French fleet falling into German hands had been significantly diminished, but at a terrible, terrible cost. When the thick, acrid smoke finally began to clear over the harbour of Mers-el-Kebir, the silence that followed the deafening roar of the 15-inch naval guns was perhaps the most terrible sound of all. In less than 20 minutes of concentrated, devastating bombardment, the Royal Navy had achieved what the German Kriegsmarine could not. They had broken the back of the French fleet in North Africa, but the cost in human life was absolutely staggering, a waking nightmare that would haunt both nations for decades to come. 1,297 French sailors lay dead or dying in the burning, twisted wreckage of their once magnificent ships. These were not the sworn enemies of the British Crown. These were men who, just weeks before, had shared rations, fought off terrifying Stuka dive bombers, and bled alongside British Tommies in the desperate defense of the French homeland. To the French, this sudden onslaught was an act of unconscionable treachery, a brutal stab in the back delivered by their closest ally in their moment of absolute greatest vulnerability. The immediate political and military fallout was as explosive as the attack itself. The newly formed Vichy French government, now under the authoritarian control of Marshal Philippe Pétain, was utterly outraged and publicly humiliated. They immediately and furiously severed all diplomatic relations with the United Kingdom, in a surreal and tragic twist to a war that had already turned the world upside down. French aircraft even launched retaliatory bombing raids against the British naval base at Gibraltar. For a terrifying, uncertain moment in the summer of 1940, it seemed entirely possible that France might officially declare war on Great Britain, joining the Axis powers out of sheer, unadulterated vengeance. The Royal Navy officers who carried out the attack were deeply scarred by it. Vice Admiral James Somerville, who had commanded Force H, privately wrote to his wife that it was the biggest political blunder of modern times and that he felt like a common murderer. He had followed his orders, but the burden of killing his former comrades weighed heavily upon his soul until his dying day. But what of the man who gave the order? What of Winston Churchill, sitting in the subterranean cabinet war rooms in London? Legend has it that when Churchill stood before the House of Commons on July the 4th to officially announce the destruction of the French fleet, tears were visibly streaming down his face. He called it the most unnatural and painful decision of his entire political life. Yet, as he finished his somber, heavy-hearted report, something extraordinary happened. The entire House of Commons, members from all political parties who had bitterly argued for years, rose to their feet and gave him a massive, roaring standing ovation. Why? Why cheer such a grim tragedy? Because in that dark, desperate hour, the brutal, unflinching strike at Mers-el-Kebir sent a message that echoed far beyond the sun-baked shores of North Africa. It was a message directed squarely at one man sitting in the Oval Office across the Atlantic Ocean, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Until that fateful moment, many influential voices in the American government, including the prominent US ambassador to Britain, Joseph Kennedy, strongly believed that Britain was finished, that they would soon inevitably sue for peace with Hitler. But the ruthless, calculated destruction of the French fleet proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that Britain would never, ever surrender. It demonstrated to the watching world that Churchill was willing to do absolutely anything, no matter how agonizing, no matter how morally ambiguous or controversial, to ensure the survival of his island and the ultimate defeat of Nazi Germany. Many respected historians argue today that Operation Catapult was the crucial turning point in American perception, the very moment that ultimately convinced Roosevelt to begin supplying Britain with the massive amounts of aid they so desperately needed through the Lend-Lease program. Without that American aid, Britain might very well have starved, run out of ammunition, and fallen to the Nazi tide. So, my friends, as the fire dies down in the grate here, we are left with the ultimate historical dilemma, a question that still ignites furious, passionate debate among scholars, military men, and ordinary people alike. Was the tragedy at Mers-el-Kebir a grim, unavoidable necessity of war, a cold, hard calculation that ultimately saved the free world from tyranny? Or was it an act of paranoid betrayal, an unforgivable strike against a loyal ally based on the mere fearful speculation of what Adolf Hitler might do? If you were sitting in Winston Churchill's chair, feeling the crushing weight of the entire British Empire and the hot breath of the Nazi war machine on your neck, what would you have done? Would you have pulled the trigger on your friends to save your home? I want you to think about that deeply, and I want you to tell me your honest thoughts in the comments below. Let us have a respectful, thoughtful debate about this dark, incredibly complex chapter of our shared history. Thank you for joining me in the library tonight. If you found this journey into the shadows of the Second World War compelling, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. There are many more stories hidden in these old dusty books, tales of the unforgiving sea, of incredible courage, and of the terrible, haunting choices men must make when the world is on fire. Until next time, keep history alive and take care of yourselves. Good night.